the way I think about it is that data should inspire creativity. There's this term that gets thrown around, which is data-driven creativity. And that's not something we want, because what data is just an extrapolation of the past, right? It's a reflection of what already happened. So if you're just utilizing data to create the next thing and you're translating that, you're just going to be making a different version of the same thing.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Video by Design podcast. Have you ever wondered how you can improve your connection and consistently drive your audience to action? My conversation with Jeff Miner, former global creative lead at Google, centers around how to supercharge your creative using data. Jeff delves into how he used data as a foundation for his creativity and how, if and when used correctly, it can help you reach your audience on a deeper level. He also shares with us his qualitative and quantitative approach, as well as his best tips on how to create an effective video strategy. So tune in, maybe take some notes, and I'd love to hear about your top takeaways from this episode in the comment section.
Can you give us a brief background of your professional career? I know you have a couple of different lanes that you went through, so I'd love to hear from the very beginning.
Yeah, so I grew up in the Portland, Oregon area, and I was a big, obsessive basketball player and fan, and basically I loved two things growing up: was basketball and hip hop music. But played basketball in high school, and I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to go to Montana State Billings. So I went there. That's in the NCAA Division II, and I played ball there for 2 years. And I ended up transferring to St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas. And St. Edward's was a much better fit for me, both as a basketball player, but also as a person. It was just, at that time, Austin has really grown up as a city. But when I got there, there still had the last vestiges of being a small town in a way. And it was just a really fun place to go to school. But it was also a good place to be from a professional standpoint, because when I was going, I remember when I transferred there and was in my first year in Austin, which would have been 2008. It was right when they were rebranding as Silicon Hills. So obviously Silicon Valley, but Austin started to become this burgeoning tech hub because of a variety of reasons. But the main thing was that it's a little bit cheaper to start a business there. And two, there's just a ton of college students in the Austin area. So when I moved there, it was 1 in 8 people were a college student. So you have University of Texas, but then you have a lot of smaller schools like the one I went to in St. Edwards. During that time, I majored in finance. And I picked it because I thought it had a lot of versatility, even though it's it is, very numbers focused. It's not math. But I remember at the time thinking, the things that I'm doing here, while it's a specific application, I feel like the skills are very universal. It's been interesting because majoring in finance, I didn't go into finance at all, but it's been interesting how it's come back and been helpful for me as I've grown in my career. So yeah, that's what I did there. And then I graduated from St. Edwards. And then eventually I worked at a startup for 3 months, cold calling. Basically, it was a social media software for small businesses. And then Google was expanding their footprint in Austin and was hiring a ton of salespeople, junior salespeople, for their Google Offers program. So Google Offers, for folks that don't remember it, and not a lot of people will because it just did not work as a product. It was a Groupon clone that was started right as people were getting hip to the notion that Groupon was not necessarily a good deal for the business owners. About a year before Google Offers was started, Google actually tried to buy Groupon, and the Groupon CEO and founder turned Google down. So Google ended up starting their own daily deal platform, and I was hired to work on that sales staff in Austin in September of 2011. So that was how I got my foot in the door at Google. From there, I worked in various capacities with small businesses and went from Austin to New York to San Francisco and then back to New York. And after about 3 years of working with small businesses in a sales capacity, I moved on to the account side, working with a larger customer in Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy, working on their US business. So basically LVMH, for those who aren't familiar, works across fashion, beauty, spirits, jewelry, basically all those durable goods in the luxury space. So the brands would be Louis Vuitton, Hennessy, obviously, Dior, now Tiffany, but all those brands. So I worked on the account side for 4 years. And during that time, I really started working with LVMH in a video capacity. So at that time, a lot of those brands didn't even have e-commerce channels. So when they were working with Google on an advertising or a media campaign, they were mainly focused on video. And that's where I started getting interested in video storytelling and creative, which is probably why I'm here talking to you today. So after 4 years of working on that account, I pivoted to a creative and strategy team called Unskippable Labs. And I worked on that team for 5+ years, kind of flexing across data, creative, strategy, measurement, media execution, basically being that conduit through the entire creative process, including the media execution.
So it's interesting, when you were in that account role and they started to have a need for video, was that something that you like rose your hand and was like, hey, like I'm interested in helping out in that? Or did they come to you? Were there things that you were naturally doing, like giving input or ideas or whatever? Like how did they end up like merging?
I think the business needed it, for one. So their business needed to expand their digital footprint through video. Mm-hmm. And so I was in the right place at the right time. However, it was also a weird kind of Venn diagram of my interests coming together. So while after basketball, my next love was film and cinema. And so I was really getting interested in video through that capacity and through storytelling in a motion picture sense. And then at the same time, when you think about a luxury brand, especially fashion, like their storytelling is very cinematic in comparison to the rest of the advertising world. So yes, they were expanding in video, but they were also doing it in a way that was very cinematic, which was connected to what I liked personally. And then the other component of it is that they were really new to utilizing the YouTube platform for video, and we had to figure out what worked for them. So that finance degree that I had, where talked about like utilizing numbers and data and analysis to come up with a solution. Like that's where I started like actually utilizing that muscle again to help them figure out what they should be doing with their creative, yes, but also like how they should be targeting their media and all of those components. So it was really like a variety of things coming together kind of, and I was just there at the right place at the right time. And I was maybe the right guy to be working on it.
Yeah, I often say that I'm the most, like, I think it's type A or like left side brained creative person and typically producers tend to have that, that skill of being able to be logistical, be practical, and be more like concrete, but then also marry that within like creative. There
has to be people on any given creative project that can create that dialogue between all of those different disciplines that you need to bring a piece of work to the market, and like, yeah, totally. Like I'm very similar in that regard, is that I feel like I have both components of that whenever I'm working on a project. And the work with LVMH was my first time realizing that.
How did it feel to put it together, like be like, wait, there is a cohesiveness. These things do work together.
Well, for me, Mariah, like I was so passionate about being a basketball player and being a college basketball player that I hadn't found my next thing that I was really working towards. And when this stuff with video locked in with LVMH, that's when things really changed for me career-wise too, where I was doing well, but I wasn't like crushing it by any stretch of the imagination. And when I finally found that this niche working with those brands on video, I was like, this is like, I'm just as into this as anything else I've ever done. And that's where I feel like was almost even more impactful, was not just that I had a knack for it, but more so that it was exciting and I was something I was passionate about, which I think is really important. It was really important for me because like I was definitely looking for the next thing that I was going to put my energy towards in a very passionate way.
Yeah. And a lot of coaches will say if you're unhappy in your career or you're not sure where to go next, like think about the things that light you up. And it sounds so cliche, but sometimes the things we do for play or for fun can be the things we do to earn a living. And, taking the energy out of just like how much money you make, when you have joy and passion and you find a way to marry that into like what you were saying with like the financial part, like the like, let's look at the data of this, but also like have creativity, like they're working together, it's probably like, is this really my job? Like, is this really what, like, does this feel like work?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And like, especially like that's when you have to also like be like, okay, I need to take a break, because totally, especially with some of the projects I was working on with LVMH towards the end, like the last year on the team, I was like, this is like everything that I'd want to do. Like, how can I only do this? Because the role that I had, I was doing tons of other stuff as well. But the thing I really wanted to do was work on the creative and strategy piece of it, specifically on video. And I'm like, also, I didn't want to be limited to just YouTube. So I'm like, what job can I have at the company that would allow me to solely focus on that? Which is when I moved into that role on Unskippable Labs.
So is that around the same time that you went to film school as well, or?
It was a little after that. So I started on the team, and it was like a duck to water. Like it just really, like, I'm like, yes, this is great. So I was having a lot of fun doing it. And then I really was getting into the creative side of it too. Like I wasn't just kind of playing on both sides. I really wanted to learn the creative piece. And then my boss at the time just had a great quote. He goes like, before you can even think about doing that, you need to bridge the gap between your taste and aesthetic and what you're capable of making. Meaning the things that your eye can see, you can't currently make. So I'm like, I can't fight that. That's true. So I was like, what is the way that I can like actually start learning how to make stuff? And I'm like, for me, I always did enjoy like being in the classroom. So I enrolled at the New School in film production and started working towards a professional certificate, specifically because I'm like, I want to have more credibility when speaking to the makers, whether it's a creative director or what have you, because I straight up, I just didn't have that experience and that knowledge. I had a passion for it, but passion doesn't always equate to wisdom. So I was like, this is maybe the best way to start gaining some of that wisdom.
That's a good one. Passion doesn't equate to wisdom.
It helps you get there.
Yeah. And so when you went to film school, were you in the back of your mind, were you thinking like with that financial background, that account background and the things you were doing, were you starting to see like how you could connect the two even further from where like you, besides loving video, just like as like a hobby or just something you like on the side, how was your brain starting to connect the two of like, oh, now I get a comprehensive view of the creative with the data or financial part of it?
Yeah, exactly. So the data piece and analysis, the strategic piece I was really getting, but the main thing that I was learning was a lot of the stuff that we did on that Unskippable Labs team was like understanding what drives effectiveness in an ad. The thing that I didn't understand though is that the goal is not to do this thing or that thing. The goal is to drive the business objective that the client wants. And when you're like analyzing, an advertiser's creative, you, without the knowledge of like the intention of what the makers were doing when they decided to create this thing, it's really hard to give like thoughtful creative feedback. And by going to film school, I started to think about intention. Starting to utilize, like always thinking, why did they do that? Not did I like this or did I not like it? Why did they choose to do that? Oh, that's why. So a lot of times you can also give much better creative feedback when you're thinking about why someone did such a thing, because you're like, oh, if you're trying to do that, maybe you can finesse it this way and it'll make that become more obvious. And when you're able to get into the maker's shoes, you can really consult and guide them in a way that's a little bit more thoughtful, respectful, and also a way that hopefully they'll respond to more, because you're not just saying like, you should do this or you should do that. You're helping them achieve what they want more effectively.
Yeah. So that brings us to our next like talking point too, is like, it's kind of a chicken or the egg. So does data influence creative, or the opposite? Should creative have an influence on data, or does it have an influence on data? So can you talk about that a little bit and kind of?
I would say that the way I think about it is that data should inspire creativity. There's this term that gets thrown around, which is data-driven creativity. And that's not something we want, because what data is just an extrapolation of the past, right? It's like, it's a reflection of what already happened. So if you're just utilizing data to create the next thing and you're translating that, you're just going to be making a different version of the same thing. So I do believe it starts with data, but it also starts with an insight. And the first piece of the creative process to me is understanding what all of this data actually means from a foundational piece. So you you can have all these numbers, but like, what's the true takeaway a brief could be built on so that creatives can execute? Because when you do that, you're getting to a place where like, okay, this is what the market's telling us. Now creatives, here's your sandbox to go play and figure out what the best way to tell the story is going to be. So yes, you do start with the data, but it's not as simple as saying like, our audience is interested in basketball, so in our ad, we should show a basketball. And you'd be surprised at how literal we are when looking at data. A lot of times, like what I said is very simple, with just saying like the audience likes this, so let's give them that. But a lot of times that's what happens. We have all these numbers, but we're not necessarily thinking about it beyond what the numbers are telling us. And like the best way to get to an insight is by unpacking all of the data so that you can get to a place where then a creative person can say, okay, I can do something with that.
So what would you say to, a client that kind of was like, but we do know that our audience likes basketball. So we, the data says that we should be showing a basketball. Like they kind of, that's an easy concept sometimes for the client to understand because it is coming from data, as opposed to sometimes translating creative to clients can be a little challenging. There's definitely productive ways to do it. What would you say?
With every single best practice or every single data point, understand what you're using that to accomplish. So let's say that my goal is that my brand's a little stale and I need to get back into the consideration set of my audience. You would start off with, okay, on this platform, we see that these creative levers are really effective at driving consideration. So one of the things that we know across all digital media, because all media is skippable now, is that typically a lot of cuts in the first 5 seconds can be really helpful in hooking the audience. But the goal isn't to put a bunch of cuts in the first 5 seconds. The goal is to get the audience past the first 5 seconds. One way to do that is to have a lot of energy up front with the way you edit it. But that's not the only way. It can be any number of things. It can be utilizing suspense. It could be utilizing sound. It could be utilizing brightness and contrast. There's any number of things that you can use. That's just one way to do it. And I think a lot of times as a strategy-driven person like myself, like what we forget about is that like, don't bucket these things into a checklist. Like it's our job to create a universe for the creativity to play in. When you're cooking, you don't always follow the recipe beat by beat. You say, oh, I don't like this, but I do like that. And you put your own spin on it. It's more of a recipe than a prescription. And I think that's what we can think about with data. Think about what it's telling you and how it's going to help you achieve your goal. And like perhaps sometimes that what's happening in the market isn't necessarily the best fit for your brand.
Yeah, and it makes you stand out, be different. Like there's so many, you might be losing all of those great audiences or losing that influence or impact just because you're so focused on like, well, this is what's proven to work based on these numbers and we're not going to stray from that. It's definitely like what you were saying within the 5 cuts in the beginning, like that is one way to capture people's attention in the first 5 seconds or, whatever. But that's definitely a film school thing of kind of saying, but is there another way to do that? Is there, like you said, bright colors, music, a person's face that's interesting, like anything. There's so many different, like, why don't we try this? It's like, there's just not one set way to do something.
You'd be shocked. You probably wouldn't be shocked, but like people would be shocked to understand how often you hear like, this is the way we do it without questioning as to like, well, but has that been successful? Like, are you happy with where your business is at? And a lot of times when people are coming to work with me, like they're wanting to improve something. And so like, there's this sort of like a contradictory, there's a dichotomy there between like, you're saying you want to do something better, but also to do something better, you may have to do something different. So I think a healthy, skepticism towards what's already been done by either like your brand or like just by the market, that's a natural part of the process. And that's what you want your creative team to be doing, is questioning what's been done and figuring out if there's a better way, both for the brand, but also like a better way to tell a story overall.
Yeah, not getting too comfortable. I've definitely experienced that in past roles where I've been brought on and I've kind of in the guise of like, oh, we've done this, we would like to improve on it, do better. So we're bringing on a whole new person to take a hold of this and really build it up. And then when I did something different, they were like, oh, well, it doesn't look like what we did in the past. And if you can give me legit reasons why you think that worked or you liked it, for sure, like I can be open to that, but wasn't the point of bringing me on to shake it up, to do it differently? Like there must have been a core need of why you said to yourself, oh, like this, we got to make a change here, you know? And I kind of presented that of like, okay, well, you know, the style, it was something as simple as like style. Like we like it this color because the last video was this color. And I said, well, that's not really like enough information, for enough of a reason for us to just keep doing it that way. Like, does your audience connect to that style differently? Is there a different tone associated with it? Or like, is that just the easiest thing that the editor was able to come up with? You know, so it's just like, there has to be a little bit more openness and being willing to adapt and try it out. And then if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And we hop to the next idea or we go back. You know what I mean? Like the flexibility, I think, maybe is like something that we can consider when we're using data strategy with like creativity.
Yeah, experimentation is the best practice. Like digital affords us the ability to like try stuff, learn from it, and move on. In an old TV or print landscape where you like kind of have one shot with stuff, like I get why sometimes the idea kind of gravitated towards back to something safer, but you can change stuff so quickly. Like if you're executing something on one of the big digital platforms, you can see within a week whether the ad's working or not. And then guess what? You can pause it, you can swap it out, you can try any number of variations. You know, video experimentation is probably my favorite thing to do. And the reason why is because we can say like, this breaks the best practices, but because of what we're seeing like here, it's worth trying out. My grandfather used to say it's a haircut, not a beheading. And like, that is like, that's a one way to say it, but it's like very much, it's like, this is not something that we need to overly engineer, because if we can see if something's working, it's not going to be 6 months later. We're going to see it pretty much in real time, whether something's hitting or not. And the ultimate question that all of us need to do is like, is it driving our business? The work that we do is not art. It's art facilitating commerce. And there's a lot of different ways that we can say something's lifting a business. It could be selling a product. It could be, creating awareness with a new audience. It could be building a email subscription list. It could be getting more followers on, your platform of choice. But if it's ultimately not driving something that's affecting your business in a positive way, those things need to be rethought. In my professional role, I'm often that consultant who can take that step back to be like, hey, like, is this ultimately helping achieve our business goal? And it's a fun place to be because it always keeps it makes it so that all the people on the project can stay aligned on stuff.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you said that. And so with that being said, that like you're not creating art for art, you're creating art to facilitate e-commerce. Is that what you said?
Yeah, some sort of commercial goal. Like a lot of times in a digital sense, it is an e-commerce, like, driving sales on a website. But in today's streaming world, like a lot of times it's branding, it's a brand objective that you're looking to like I mentioned, like if I'm a brand that's people don't want to buy, not really interested in it as much anymore, like I need to figure out like what are the stories and the creative levers I need to pull to get me back in the consideration set, and the creative choices need to be thought of through that goal.
Speaking from my point of view, when, and also I'm sure you experience as well, when a client comes to you and says, we need a video for this business goal, whatever, having that goal defined is super important. So that way you as the creator know where to go. And like you said, we come back to this, at the end of the day, is all of this creative and data actually achieving that specific goal? Do you find that sometimes even like taking those steps back of being like, do we have a defined goal? Do we understand why we want this defined goal?
All the time. Like and it's it's no shade to anybody. It's just one of those things that just happens sometimes, is that you lose sight of the goal. But also I've been part of many campaigns where the objective was stated at the beginning as driving awareness. And then when we're doing a recap of the campaign, they're saying, how many sales did it drive? That's a bait and switch. So I think it's defining the goal up front before any sort of work is started. And honestly, the objective of a campaign should be defined and agreed upon and aligned upon before the brief is written, because the brief should be, centered and aligned and, focused on driving that objective, which then, great creative work comes from a great brief. If you get great work out of a bad brief, that's luck. Mm-hmm. And I think like a great brief needs to have the objective clearly defined, but also throughout the process, consistently circling back to that objective, I think helps us stay on point when we get to like recap stage, when we're talking about whether it's successful or not, because it happens all the time. I'm thinking of a very specific campaign where it was like, we talked about all of these e-commerce business we sold. And then the next thing out of the person's mouth was, but it's like, our e-commerce business doesn't matter. How did we do it? How did we help drive awareness? And I'm like, it was very frustrating, I think, for the people who worked on the campaign. I was just the guy reporting the numbers, but it was very frustrating for the people because they're like, you told us you wanted to drive your e-commerce business. And I think the clients often, like, it's again beyond their control too. There's a lot of things that change throughout the process, but I think consistently circling back to what our objective is maybe can help when we get to the stage where we're talking about whether it worked or not.
Like having a couple of checkpoints throughout like the beginning to the very end. So that way we're on target, we're staying focused, like we're still on the same page about what we're doing, right? Because sometimes you get excited.
Yeah. Well, and also too, like you can also flex. Like, so if you are consistently checking in, a lot of times you can make tweaks to better align with an evolution in the goal. It happens all the time. Like we can do stuff in post-production that can make an asset that was maybe best designed for, an upper funnel type goal, and we can do some stuff to make it more effective as lower funnel. It's just that collaboration and communication and speaking the language of all the various stakeholders, I think is really important throughout, which is something you definitely probably have experienced in your role as well. Is like the way you would talk to an art director is not the same as way you talk to a measurement person, which is not the same way you talk to a brand marketer, and so like understanding what that common language is and translating when needed to ensure that everybody's aligned is, I think, a equally important part of the process.
Yeah, listening. I think that's just a skill in life generally, like really listen and listen first.
2 ears, one mouth.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to come back to this point, and you had mentioned it before. You talked about qualitative and quantitative approach, and I'm sure that comes from your finance background, obviously, or data. Can you just talk more about that?
Yeah, it's definitely started because in finance and stuff, you're definitely working with large data sets, but we live in a world now where everything can be measured, which is great. But with that, the way I like to think of it is that the quantitative, which is the large macro type of look at an individual campaign or a vertical or a category or whatever, that tells you what's happening, but it doesn't tell you why it's happening. And so when I think about quantitative plus qualitative, it's understanding the what and the why, because the what can tell you kind of like what to do right now, but it doesn't necessarily help you evolve your strategy going forward because you're not questioning as to why did it unfold this way. There's 2 video experimentation projects that I think illustrate this pretty effectively. So one is with Puma, a beloved client of mine, great folks there. And one of the things we noticed in a research project that I led, looking at premium and luxury fashion, tech, those type of brands, we noticed that nostalgia was really effective for driving brand consideration and that it was really underutilized. So we went to Puma and we're like, hey, like, you have some assets that would really allow us to test this in market really effectively. Would you be interested? We talked about it and said, okay, for us to do this, we would have to make these changes to these assets to run the test and get the level of insight that we would want. So we did the test and we ran it. And so the first part of it, the quantitative piece, is actually running real in-market media so that you can see it's not a focus group. It's like a real in-market test with real media dollars behind it to see how it performed against that metric of brand consideration, because that's our goal. So we ran it and we saw that the ad that was the most nostalgic and the most throwback, the most vintage, was the one that was by far the top performer on brand consideration. So our initial hypothesis was confirmed in that nostalgia is an effective way to drive brand consideration. That's the what. However, not every campaign going forward, maybe the goal for brand consideration will stay, but not every campaign can be nostalgic. So it's like, why is nostalgia so effective for driving brand consideration? So that's when you get into the more qualitative piece of it, which is more focus group, where you're asking questions not based on yes and no, but based on perception. And you ask some questions like, how did this ad make you feel? What was your favorite part about it? What's the best way to describe this ad? And you put in a lot of options, including nostalgia, because maybe it's not even nostalgic to them. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's our own bias bringing it in. Mm-hmm. And in the instance of this Puma ad, we saw, yes, it was definitely perceived as nostalgic, but we said, what about the nostalgic elements did you like? And the overwhelmingly number one choice was, it made me feel, provided a sense of calm and made me feel relaxed. So I didn't mention this piece of it till now, was that we launched this study in November of 2020. And there was a lot going on in November 2020. We were in the throes of a hellscape of the US election. It was right after into the next wave of the coronavirus. And people were like really anxious. So the fact is that story, which was over 2 years old, that we re-edited and reformatted so it was a little bit more effective as an ad based upon what we know, that allowed them to make a significant dent in growing and help them grow their consideration set. But it wasn't because it was nostalgic. Nostalgic was the element that helped them provide a sense of calm for the audience. Now, thinking about that going forward, there's no limit of things that I could do to offer that sense of peace and calm. Nostalgia, yeah, maybe that'll work for the next campaign, but think about all of the other things that you can offer. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the piece when you combine the what with the why, that's when you can get to that's an insight, right? Nostalgia is effective. Cool. Nostalgia helps provide a sense of calm, and calm is what consumers are looking for, and they'll reward brands for that. That's something that you could build a ton of campaigns around. So I think that's a really tight and cohesive story about how those two components working together become much more valuable than just looking at performance alone.
Mm-hmm. And that's the data. You're looking at the data the surveys, the tests, the studies, all of those things that now are just a foundation. Like we're coming back to this idea of a foundation. And like you said, we can literally provide peace and calm in so many different ways. And it's almost like it opens up the doors of possibilities. Yeah.
The thing when we were talking to them, like when we like, this was one of those slides, like we're going through it, we're going through like, cool. And then like, I'm like, we're going to stop and talk about this one right here, because this is the thing. If you guys only know take away one thing, is that think about in your creative strategy for the next 18 to 24 months, how your ads can provide this feeling. Then someone goes, oh, that's why I've been listening to lo-fi music all the time. Or that's why I've been watching, these peaceful cooking videos. I'm like, exactly. Like maybe you do something with lo-fi. Maybe you do something there, or like maybe you do something completely different that is a better fit for the brand. Like one of the things with Puma is they actually leaned into the nostalgia further, and they did this series that was called For All Time, which was basically utilizing some of their older brand ambassadors, including Clyde Frazier, who's their original ambassador from 1973, to tell the story about like just themselves and how, their first sneaker, that type of thing. The reason why I like it so much is obviously I like that type of storytelling, of course, but it's because there's no limit to what you can do with an insight like that. And I think we've seen a lot of brands tapping into that. That's something we learned in November of 2020. But if you watch the Super Bowl ads this year, there was a lot of that similar thing happening because it's effective. It's effective.
Yeah. And even thinking that brings up another, like it sheds light on the fact of like what's happening in society culturally and in the present can influence obviously people's behaviors. And that may not be something that we immediately go to when we're thinking about like doing a campaign, driving a specific business goal, but it definitely has an influence on it. And it's so funny that through that process, that's what you discovered. Like, wow, yeah, everyone's anxious. This made them not anxious. So now they're going to remember it.
Also, though, as a brand, you're giving a gift to the audience. You're like most advertising is saying, do this now. But an ad that can actually offer something before they've done anything for us That's incredible. Like, and I think the thing that you mentioned though is insight plus instinct. You have the insight about this, but then you start thinking about it in your own life. And like, I think a traditional creative person was really great at like utilizing their instincts and expertise and experience to come up with ideas. But now with everything that we know, because of all the capabilities of measurement and big data, we can combine that traditional instinct for story with the things that we know drive effectiveness and kind of create the center of the Venn diagram. That Puma example is like a really nice way to think about it, I believe, because you have this thing that like creatives would love to do, which is telling the history of a shoe, which is what this ad did. But then you have the overlap with like, oh, here's the reason why we're doing it. And then you have that insight in the middle, which is like, okay, our storytelling should revolve around providing a sense of calm and peace.
So I wanted to ask you, what are reoccurring elements of an effective video strategy?
There are certain tactics that recently have been effective consistently. However, those tactics will likely change. So when we're thinking about it from a tactical perspective, the right type of nostalgic story is super duper effective. When you get your inclusivity principles down, that's definitely a strong element for driving effectiveness. So the key there is that inclusivity is more than skin deep, is what I like to say. So it's not just casting differently, it's actually telling your story differently based upon a lot of more nuanced creative levers. So like beyond casting, you're thinking of, the script, you're thinking of the setting, you're thinking of obviously the language, you're thinking about all the way the product is communicated. Like we did an experiment with Bobby Brown once looking into inclusivity, and we saw that yes, we casted women of different ethnicities. That was great. But the thing that took it to the top was that we nuanced the script so that the product benefit was authentic to the person speaking. So the reason why a Black woman chooses a foundation is different from why a white woman would. There's a need that a Black woman would have because of her skin tone that a white woman wouldn't have when it comes to a foundation product. And by nuancing the script for that need, we saw that ads were much more effective. So you think about all of those nuanced creative levers beyond the most obvious, that's when inclusivity becomes just an incredibly powerful tool for effectiveness. Another thing that we're seeing is just that ads that don't necessarily feel like ads, I think the nostalgia piece a lot of times can provide that because it's a sense of escapism or what have you. But I think there's this element, like, especially on a lot of the platforms, I think TikTok and YouTube really reflect this, is like the edutainment, you learn something, you're entertained. A lot of times the ads are not fitting the traditional model of a 15 or a 30. The ad with Puma that I talked about was a minute 33. There's not a lot of places you can air that from in a traditional media standpoint. So I think thinking outside the bounds of how an ad is traditionally defined, your short form ads are really good for driving awareness. But if you're trying to drive consideration, like you should be looking at ads that are longer than 60 seconds. You can think outside the bounds of what you would traditionally define an ad as. You'd be surprised how many times you're still looking at briefs that are just, I need a 30 and a 15. And like in some cases, that's maybe the worst thing you could do depending on what your objective is. So I think thinking more broadly about what an ad can be. Nissan did a spot recently for their new Aria, a really nicely done ad with all of the best practices, like great visual language. You can see it on your phone, you can see it on the TV, good pacing, good tempo, but it still kind of fit the structures of what a normal ad would be. And then I was also kind of, I'm a curious guy. I'm like, that's a nice spot. So I went on their channel. They also have a 4-hour lo-fi spot that's just like in that, like those lo-fi videos you see on, like the animated style, where it just has the person in the driver's seat driving, showing the interior of the car. And it's 4 hours just with some lo-fi jams. And they ran it as a pre-roll and it like crushed it. So it was, I don't know, it rushed on, and you couldn't obviously run that on television, but you could run it on streaming. Like you couldn't run it on linear, but you could run it on a streaming platform via skippable media. And, it has almost 2 million views now, and the response is overwhelmingly positive. And then I'm like, of course, I'm putting the left brain on it, and I'm looking at the spot. I'm like, one of the things we know about car ads is that the interior is just as valuable as the exterior. And guess what? You're just looking at an animated version of the interior of the car for as long as you're watching it. I'm like, that's interesting. So by experimenting with this lo-fi spot that is definitely working for them, they've also hit on some best practices that their traditional spot didn't do. It's been interesting to think about when brands do that, how they can stumble into a formula that may be even more valuable. So that was a long-winded answer. So those are like tactics, I think. Mm-hmm. But I would say the through line of everything is figuring out how to create this flywheel and this two-way street between all aspects of the creative process. So from data all the way into the creative expression, into the execution, and then continuing to keep that dialogue going. That is where I believe sustained solid creative strategy comes from. So I sometimes get to work on these projects where we go end to end. So, I'm there in pre-production, I'm there at the briefing stage, right? Then the pre-production all the way through it. And then also I do some of the analysis as well to say, hey, this worked, this didn't work, this is what you should do next. Those type of projects where you have a person that's like there throughout it and like bringing all of those silos together is I think pretty rare, especially at large organizations. Mm-hmm. But the ones that are doing the best storytelling, you can just see it like just by who attends the meetings. And when we're talking about things is that they always have representation across all of the components of what a successful advertising campaign looks like. And I think you can get to where those successful tactics are implemented and all that when you're consistently having the dialogue across all the stakeholders, right? If you have this like one-way street between measurement and data into creative, then like you're constantly just getting orders one way and like you don't have the opportunity to inject creativity into the data, which is where something really important happens. Like, and so really thinking of it as a flywheel is like each campaign is yet another piece to us to continue to refine our creative strategy and to evolve it, because there's a lot of black and white with how we look at creative. This was good, this was bad. But a lot of times within a campaign, there's so many pockets of things that are really interesting that can help make the work better going forward. And you can't do that unless you have all of the people working together throughout the entire process.
Absolutely. We've definitely come across that too, where like someone's in marketing just heading this whole thing, but then somewhere down the conversation, a salesperson comes and then they're like, oh, well, what's this video doing for me? Or they were invited to the conversation in some way, shape, or form. And it's like, was their goal heard? Was their goal in alignment with the marketing person or with the brand awareness or like content? Like having a unified goal and hearing it from everyone, like you said, all the stakeholders from beginning to end as well.
I sometimes act like I have all these pieces of wisdom, but it's like, it's all just like I've learned it through doing. And like the video experimentation process, to run a video experiment with both the quantitative and qualitative, like you think about what has to happen. One, you have to have creative work that you can test that actually fits a hypothesis that you're looking to learn about. So again, circling back to Puma, all right, the insight that I wanted to learn about was about like what's going on with nostalgia. Why is this thing seemingly everywhere, but no ads are using it? And yet when brands do it, it works well. Like we got to figure this out. So to do that, to kick off the process, you gotta work with a creative team that actually has the work that can that can test that. That's one. But to actually execute the test, you need the media folks involved because it's going to be with real in-market media. Mm-hmm. But to actually get to align on the measurement protocols and the tools we're going to use for measurement, we need to have the analytics folks involved. Then to also understand how that's going to play into the future of the campaign, you need to have the brand and marketing folks involved. When I do the reshare of of the results and I run through everything, we have representation from every single person. And I've heard this so many times, but because of that, the way the project worked and everybody being involved, and then they're all in the recap, they're like, this is the first time I've been in a media review before. Like the creative people whose work was in the media, they're like, I never knew how it worked, like if it worked or not. And like it's not to throw shade again, it's more so to just like, these are the blind spots that we have because of like the industry we're in. These are not things like I've had things like that happen too. Mm-hmm. But by having like these, these type of projects, it allows us to break down those barriers between, and so that we can create the dialogue between all of the components that make a successful strategy.
Yeah, I, of course, would love to be involved in those conversations. I even think Dustin, too, recently had reached out to a client that we did work for, I think it was last year, and was like, hey, how'd that video ever do for you? Like what were the outcomes besides you guys loved it? We had a follow-up call when it was immediately done. Cool, great. But 6 months, 8 months down the road, how is that doing for you? And they were like, oh, yeah, it actually increased visits to this specific landing page by 500%. And it influenced people to apply. It was kind of like an internal recruiting, it was used for recruiting and stuff like that. So like knowing that now helps us like, wow, that was effective. It worked. Now the next client we come to, that's something we're thinking about off the bat.
I was talking to a creative director today that worked on a project we did with MAC Cosmetics. And we were talking, she goes, I actually never saw the results of what we did. And she was involved all through it, like looking at the way, because we were adjusting some copy in their CTA and really getting into the nitty gritty on the copy. And she was like, we were writing together and we were like this. And she goes, I never actually saw the full recap. And I'm like, what? How is that possible? So I remember that was a learning for me, though. I'm like, I got to make sure that everybody that had a hand in this is a part of the process. You know, I talked about how successful that was with Puma. That doesn't mean I get it right every time, because that was one where it's like very much like, oh, shoot, like, Jen, you didn't see that? That's a travesty, because you also did, you know, because we don't want the conversation with the folks, the creative team to end with, oh, the client loved it. The client may have loved it before it went to market, but their opinions can change. They might really love it after it goes to market. They might not like it so much after it goes to market. Depends on what business perspective it did or didn't drive. So I think having that knowledge it's just going to make everybody better too. Like as a creative person, you know, you need to know whether it's driving commerce. You know, it's not just art. It's art.
I'm guilty of that. Like just saying like a project I directed, I'm like, oh, they loved it. Like, but I didn't know what, you know, like, of course, like they visually loved it, but like you just said, like 3 months from now, do they really love it? Do they love it as much as they loved it before? Like, you know, following up is super important.
Yeah, I think like I'm almost like religious in my questioning of like, but what happened? Because I actually have a very specific aesthetic that I like, but I can't let that make me biased towards it. Yes. Because I like it doesn't matter. Like it does not matter what I like. Now I should be building something that I'm passionate about, of course, but the end result of like, I want to be proud of the work, but ultimately I need the audience to respond, and that like, being happy with what you made. I'm not happy with if what I made didn't drive business. It's always a basketball reference from me, but you played a good game, but your team lost. Like you shouldn't be happy. You know, you had 20 points, but you ended up losing. You can be like, I'm glad I did a good effort, but I should not be joyous and smiling after the game because we lost. You know, the goal is to win the basketball game. The goal is to have business. So you can be proud that you put in your best effort, but ultimately you shouldn't be satisfied unless the work is something you're proud of and also drove business.
So that segues really nicely into my next question, and we can kind of wrap up with this idea, communicating that to the client. How do we effectively, as the creatives, as the data team, as the people that are taking a hold of this campaign for a client, how do we communicate like that strategy as a big influence on their campaign?
Ensure that there's a clear objective that the client has given you, and that you don't start work until that objective is clearly defined. And it can't be two a lot of times. Like one of the things we know is that one ad typically is only good at one objective. So if you have a brief that says, I want to drive awareness and consideration, you're likely going to need, or a client that's like, I want to drive awareness, consideration, and also drive e-commerce sales. Like that brief needs to be reflective of that and have multiple assets as part of the plan. Right. Yes. So I think the first thing is being without compromise and saying you need to clearly define what this objective is before we do any work. Then tell me kind of the other components of what you're looking for. And then we can develop a strategy that we believe, based upon both, you know, insight and instinct, can deliver against those objectives in the voice that you're comfortable with and are looking for. So I think like that's the piece that always needs to be clearly articulated and be done throughout the process. But the other piece of it is that like great strategy leads to great work. Great work doesn't lead to a great strategy. And there's no shortage of case studies that have people talking about it. They're never talking about being on set, making something as like the first step of it. That's like the logical almost endpoint of it, is like, now we're making something. This is the quote unquote easy part because we did all the hard work doing that. So I think on clearly saying that like, yes, we have to have a great strategy, but also saying that like we should be spending all of our time in the strategy planning and pre-production phase.
Yes.
Because when we're on set, it is, as my old coach liked to say, take the L out of lover. Once you're on set, it's over. Like, that's a little bit of an exaggeration because you can do some fun stuff in post-production nowadays. But I think for the client, they always want to get to the shoot. They want to get the work and they want to get it out there. It's like,
yes,
take your time. I like to think of strategy as a sculpture. So like a sculpture starts off as a big brick or whatever, big piece of like a rock of some sort or whatever. And like, you chisel away, and little by little, then eventually you have something. But it's really like hammering and chiseling away until you get to the really right place. It's not something that's just kind of born overnight. It's a thing of, pressure plus time, to create that. And I think if clients understand that and continuously are aligned to the objectives, that's where a great brief can come from, which then the work will spring from.
A visual just popped into my mind when you were talking about that. And I don't know if it's an old SpongeBob episode, but there's one where he like does the David like statue or whatever. And he like does hit it once and all of the other rocks fall and it's immediately like the perfect statue. But how silly is that? Like to even think of any creative process as like, yes, like it's just going to come together like that. There's not going to be chipping away, making a mistake, but then working around it. Like there's no mistakes in art. There's just, you have to work at it. It's not just one step.
Well, that's exactly right. And also like very rarely will you like to get to that eureka moment, you have to slam your head against the wall a lot of times to finally get there. Right. Like there's always that moment where you're like, that's it. Right. Like the Puma, like I'm going to keep circling back to Puma just because we talked about it. Like we were hammering away at that thing to figure out like, how did this ad do so well? We had a hunch based upon certain things. We're like, what is going on here that this was so effective at a time when nobody was thinking about buying a Puma sneaker or whatever? Like they were thinking about the election and like how much longer the pandemic was going to go. We hammered away. I'm like, is it that? No, it's not that. Like, and then you ran your research, you're looking at it, you're looking at the numbers. And then all of a sudden there's that moment that the dots connect. And you're like, that's it. But that doesn't happen just like, it's not just like, oh, that's it. Like it takes a long time. Like it doesn't usually happen like that. Every once in a while you'll get lucky, and it'll come together maybe quicker than usual, but usually it takes a little bit of, that is the creative process, is
chiseling away
at it. Yeah. And then eventually you're like, hey, look at this.
So Jeff, you've given so many good sound bites of like advice or just analogies, which I think are also super helpful when you're listening to like metaphors, analogies, and things like that. But if there is one piece of advice that you could give around creative strategy, what would it be?
Experimentation is the best practice. This is one that I've gone back to on everything, but like, do not get so wrapped up in what you've done before that you can't be open to doing something new. The culture moves so incredibly fast. Question your methodology and question your own process. And like, am I doing this just because I'm comfortable, or is there something I can do better? And I think I make something better each time. Make something better, and the more you do that, the more comfortable you get. Right? It's like, because uncertainty is no fun, but ambiguity can kind of be fun, where you're like, I'm not sure I can navigate this. And it's sort of fun because there's, you can try something, you can learn from it and move on. That wasn't always the case. So as culture moves fast, it allows us to fail fast and move on. And I think adopting that spirit and realizing that is, I think a lot of great things can spring from that type of attitude.
Willingness to adapt,
For sure.
Keep up. It's challenging, but it opens the doors to a lot of possibilities. Like you said, experimenting, like how could we get anywhere, learn and discover new things without keeping that openness, you know?
Yeah. But also, and have that spirit towards yourself as well as like on your own work. So like, I come in as a consultant and I'm like, oh, this based upon it. But like after every one of those projects, I need to be doing the same thing. It's like, did this work? I've always done this design on this slide, or like this is what we did with the copy. That I don't know if that's hitting like it used to. We got to do something different. And I think applying that spirit, it's easier to apply it to someone else's work. Can be difficult sometimes to apply it to your own self, but that's a muscle that I think, because there's no shortage of feedback in the world right now, but I think important feedback you can always get is the one that is honest feedback from yourself, because nobody can be, being reflective of your process, of your work. That is, I think, going to be always the most valuable, because more than anybody, obviously, what the intention was, and you're not always going to get it right. And being honest in that reflection, I think, is just always it's going to help evolve your approach to the work.
Absolutely. So you kind of mentioned it before. So where can our audience find you? You have given us so many, like I said, so many gems of advice, so many great examples. You have so much experience, and you're still learning, you're still adapting, like you come across to me as someone who's just like, yeah, this worked, I've learned from this, but I kind of want to see this, and maybe we could try this in the future. And that's refreshing, because I don't think a lot of people in this industry sometimes are willing to be that open and being like, I could try and I could fail at this, but I tried and I took the data and, this worked, I learned from it. So how can the audience engage with you?
Yeah, the best way is to reach out to me via email. So jeff@jeffmineradvertising.com, if you didn't catch the sign over my right shoulder. But also I'm really active on LinkedIn. So linkedin.com/jeffmineradvertising. Right now I'm in the midst of sharing a variety of case studies I've worked on over the past 5+ years, with the idea of utilizing previous work to showcase an existing thought process. So an existing strategic approach that we've seen be effective, and that I've seen be really effective now, and what I believe will be effective going next. So that's a great place to engage with me as well. And then also, I have a fairly robust YouTube channel of content as well. So I have some thought pieces. Last year I produced a talk show called Creative Caviar that dug into a different creative topic each time. So there's 3 episodes of that. So there's one focused on driving ROI, another one on inclusivity, and another one on storytelling for the holidays. So there's a lot of content on there. So that's youtube.com/jeffmineradvertising. And I am actively consulting with brands big and small. So if there is a creative challenge that people want to talk about, I would be happy to discuss. I work obviously across the strategy, creative, and the video development process. So if there is a challenge that you have, I can likely help you out in one way or another.
All right. Well, thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate your time and everything, your openness. And this was a really great conversation. I'm definitely going to have to listen to it twice and jot down some more notes.
Yeah. I definitely, I appreciated this as well, Mariah, and the really great questions, and also just like fun stuff to talk about. Obviously, like this is stuff that both me and you are passionate about. So I'm glad we could get into it.
We're like dweebing out over here, film school nerds.
For sure.
All right. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.